to a public seminar today. I have so many familiar faces, old friends, old professor. Very glad that we have quite a full house today. I believe that because of Professor Duncan McCargo, you have a fan club in Thailand.
Oh, no.
And perhaps also some plainclothes officer that's also familiar face for our faculty.
Oh, right. Okay.
Feel free to have a khanom too. Khanom is for everyone, government officer, students and professor.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to a talk. The title is Trends in Southeast Asian Politics, Mediated Populism, Electoralism and Authoritarianism. The talk will be given by Professor Duncan McCargo from the University of Leeds. Now you hold another position too, right? At the University of Columbia
University.
Okay. I'm not sure everyone is a fan of David Letterman show. I think Professor Duncan also fit in that category. My guest need no introduction. So if you are students or scholars or observant who are interested in Thai politics and Southeast Asian politics, Professor Duncan is one of the most prolific scholars. He published a lot. I don't know how he can find a time. It's like he published 10 articles per year and also a series of books and edited volume. So it's our honor today for the Faculty of Political Science. We are celebrating 70 years of the faculty. So from now on, from September to June of next year, we have a lot of seminars and public talks. If anyone wants to follow about the updated information about this series of seminars, please go to the Facebook page, Direct Chayanam Research Center, and most of the seminar and talk will be broadcast through Facebook Live, okay, including today. So I talked to Professor Duncan. What we are going to do is he's going to give a talk for about 40 to 50 minutes in English, because I think everyone in this room need no translation. But many slides, PowerPoint slide of Professor Duncan will have both the English text and Thai text, so that might be easier for our audience who watch from home through the Facebook Live. Okay, so after the talk, I will open for Q&A, and I think we have enough time for that. We have 2 hours for the whole session. Okay. So the floor is yours, Duncan.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks very much, Ajahn Projak, for that very warm introduction. It's great to have a chance to come and speak here at Thammasat again. I was affiliated with the faculty here about 20 years ago when I was doing one of my projects. It's always been a kind of second home for me. I guess I've been coming here for nearly 30 years. And it's always a great pleasure. I don't remember such a nice room as this, though. The facilities in the faculty have really improved. Yeah, so that's absolutely fabulous. So it's great to have a chance to be here. I'm always rather nervous speaking in front of this kind of audience because I see many people who probably know more about this topic than I do. So all I'm really doing is throwing out some ideas for debate and discussion. Although
one will be better.
The better, yeah, okay. Thanks. Although probably a lot of people in this room are more familiar with what I've been doing about Thailand, I have also had a chance to go to a number of other countries in the region over the past few years. I've been traveling quite a bit to Cambodia, I've been in the Philippines, I've been in Burma, and Indonesia. I just came from Indonesia. Malaysia. So I'm trying to situate what's going on across the region within some kind of comparative context. But actually this presentation is still very rudimentary. There's a lot that I need to figure out and work on. So I hope that I'll get some feedback that will help me to do exactly that today. Okay, I'm here on behalf of the University of Leeds, and everybody who watches Thai soap operas know that you always have to begin with the commercials. So I have to tell you a little bit about my university, because we have lots of students from Thailand coming to Leeds, but we don't have many studying politics. I don't know what happens to all these Rathasat graduates. It seems that I've just been talking to some people about this. A lot of people decided after doing a degree in politics or international relations, they are now going to study business. It's a huge trend from everybody that I talk to, and same story I got in Indonesia. So this is another regional trend. I hope we can have more people coming from faculties like this who decide to pursue their studies in fields related to politics and international relations a little bit more. So if anybody's interested in talking to me about that, we have lots of master's degree programs, which loads of them, intersection of... Yeah, I'm in marketing mode here. So intersection of stuff about development, stuff about IR, and stuff about politics. I also have one great disappointment in my life so far. I have my former PhD students in Jula, in Chiang Mai University, in Mahasarakham, in Nida, in Mo'ubon, and so it goes on, and in Mo'o. So far, I don't actually have any of my PhD students teaching here in Thammasat University. So that's one of my dreams too. Okay, so I got 25 years at Leeds this year, 25 PhD students finished, and about half of them are Thai. So they're all over the place, but actually not here. We had one master's graduate from Leeds, and she disgracefully moved to another very famous university not very far from here. So now I don't actually have a single Leeds graduate right here in this faculty. So that's one of my dreams, you know, for the next few years, that maybe we can do that. Okay, let me talk about politics. I am talking about Southeast Asia. Let me say, you know, I'm very nervous speaking in Southeast Asia, coming from the UK and spending half my time in the US and being cast in the role of making critical comments about things, because I have to say from the beginning, whatever problems various Southeast Asian countries, including Thailand, are facing, arguably, the UK is in a worse situation right now. You can change presidents, you can change prime ministers, military governments can come and go, constitutions can be rewritten, but once you've left the European Union, they probably will not want us back for a very, very long time. So what's happening in my country, the politics of hope and fear are very much alive in the UK too. People have been thinking politically in not a very intellectual way, but in an emotional way. People have been driven by emotions, and emotions sometimes overpowered their reason. So I come from a country which just made an incredibly emotional and completely unreasonable decision, which is going to sabotage us politically, economically, and socially for decades to come. So that's the context with which I'm making a few observations about Southeast Asia here. I'm also spending half the year in the United States. We have our own Mr. T in Thailand. Of course, the US now has its own special Mr. T. We'll try not to mention his name, but the politics of hope and fear is something that very much characterized not just the 2016 referendum over Brexit in the UK, but the 2016 presidential elections in the US. So what we're talking about here is a global phenomenon of emotions seeming to play a larger part in political decision-making, associated with three trends that I'm going to talk about. Mediated populism, and people are asking me to translate that into Thai. I'm going to have trouble. We'll try later, but in fact, you know, we can have a competition for the best translation of that impossible to translate phrase. Electoralism, which again is a bit hard to translate into Thai, but the persistence of elections, and then different modes of authoritarianism. We can see these things played out in various countries around the region. By the way, most of my lectures these days are just an excuse for me to show people my photographs. I came in here a little bit late because I was out taking photographs of soldiers outside the Defense Ministry, the Democracy Monument, various other things that I'm afraid might, before very long, be moved or modified in some way. I want to get pictures of them before anything changes around this area, because things seem to be changing very fast. So this is a picture I took in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, at the national monument in 2013. That was an interesting moment 5 years ago. You had an election in Cambodia where Hun Sen was very complacent. He never showed his face during the election campaign. The CPP believed the election was theirs. It was just going to fall into their laps. And instead, they were hammered by the opposition. They lost a lot of seats to the opposition, CNRP, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, and started to become very scared. In Malaysia, UMNO, Najib, again, were very confident that they'd be able to win that election. They did win the election, but not really. They lost the popular vote in the election, and more people voted for the opposition than for UMNO and Barisan Nasional. So they had reason to be very concerned as well. So to me, these two elections 5 years ago trigger all these questions. What's the future of long-standing governments in the region? What kind of trends can we anticipate? Thailand, 2014, not from my point of view a very happy story. Another military coup. Ajahn Kassin and I were in London on that day, and we had a lot of fun talking about it in a conference that we conveniently pre-organized at LSE, precisely so that we could discuss the Thai coup. And then, not long after that, you had elections in Indonesia and the election of Joko Widodo, which most people thought was a positive side. So, kind of hope and fear mixed. We had, to me, it was fear in Thailand and hope in Indonesia. At least there was hope somewhere. 2015. Finally, people have been waiting for something resembling a free and fair election in Burma, Myanmar, for many years. We had it. NLD won. Aung San Suu Kyi won. We all like Aung San Suu Kyi, right? Not anymore. No. We did then, not now. So people were investing hope in that NLD government and Aung San Suu Kyi, and then now their hopes more have turned to fears and anxiety about what's going on in the future and how really different that government is from the authoritarian government that it replaced. The electoralism did not displace authoritarianism in the way that we might have hoped. So what is going on? 2016, it was my great privilege to be in Manila for the presidential election. And I was able to go to the final campaign rallies of the candidates, including Duterte's final campaign rally in Luneta Park, where somebody sneaked me into the VIP section. I was sitting right up above this crowd, and Duterte's there saying, "The answer to all our problems is to catch all the criminals, shoot them dead, and throw them into the sea." And people were roaring, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And I really started to feel that this is something alarming. The next year, actually a few months later, I had a chance to go to Nuremberg. I went to the site of the Nazi rallies. I was trying to imagine what it was going to be like, but my brain was sort of cutting between Nuremberg and Duterte, the feeling of the celebration of violence and this very intense darkness, and yet mobilizing a lot of enthusiasm and excitement from people in the Philippines, including many of my good friends, and Duterte continues to have very high approval rate, fallen slightly, but very high, shockingly high. So what's going on there? Okay, so 2017, seems that Hun Sen learned some lessons from Thailand, and now Thailand might be looking at Hun Sen with interest. One solution when you have a problematic political party is to ban it. The Thai solution, of course, has always been a bit half-baked because you ban the party and then allow them to open up again under a slightly different name with the same logo but just change the letters in it. And we saw that happen twice. Thai Rak Thai became Palang Prachachon, which became Pheu Thai. So you ban the party, but you don't really ban the party because you allow it to pop up again with a new identity, which is actually, everybody knows, the same identity. Hun Sen clearly looked at that and thought, this doesn't really work well for me. I've got a problem. We've just done very badly in the local elections, the Commune Council elections, which I also attended in Cambodia in 2017. What's the solution? Let's just ban the CNRP, the opposition party, completely, permanently, and not allow them to reopen under a new name, and throw one of the leaders in jail while the other leaders already off in France, conveniently out of the way. So, more drastic than Thailand. Unfortunately, it does leave us wondering, whether this kind of solution could be favored elsewhere in the region. Is this a model? Then, do we have a success story, a positive story? UMNO, Najib, the horrible corruption surrounding those so-called development projects in Malaysia, thrown out of office. But who throws Najib and UMNO out of office but Mahathir, and wasn't he the guy who kind of invented these people and most of this sort of political structure anyway? So you have somebody whose reputation from the past is as being very autocratic and authoritarian, who's come to rescue democracy from itself. Is this a solution? And is this something we can find elsewhere in the region? Whether it's going to work elsewhere, I don't know, but what's certainly the case is that in the Philippines now, Marcos' son, Bongbong Marcos, is lined up to be a successor to Duterte. He could even become vice president because he's contesting the outcome of the vice presidential election. Yes, that was 2 years ago, but in the Philippines, legal processes can go on for a long time. It's even possible that he could become vice president before very long. So, if we look across all these countries, we get similar kinds of phenomena. We have polarization between two camps. We know about it very well in Thailand. I don't need to tell anybody here about what we used to call yellow versus red, which got confusing when Suthep started wearing red, so I don't know whether it's yellow versus red anymore, but two camps broadly pro and anti-Thaksin. In the Philippines, you have those who love Duterte and those who hate Duterte. In Cambodia, you've got those who love Hun Sen and the CPP and those who hate Hun Sen and the CPP. The pattern across the region is of this very intensely polarized politics where people are divided into two camps, and there are fewer and fewer people in the middle with whom one can have anything resembling a sensible conversation. It gets harder and harder. More and more you have to separate out your friends into the ones on one side and the ones on the other and meet them in different groups, in different restaurants, because if you try to get them together and you want to ask them about politics, which is all I really want to find out about half the time, then the conversation is going to go badly. So, what can we make of all that? Emerging themes. Here's another of my photographs. Nothing political about that, of course, unless you look closely at the wristband. This is at the Erawan Shrine at the height of the Bangkok shutdown protests. Are they praying for more money, for a good marriage for the daughter, or are they praying for the Yingluck government to collapse and for General Prayut to come in and rescue Thailand from itself? Possibly all of those at the same time. So different kinds of emotions and hopes are mixed up. But what we see across the region, the rise of big personalities, larger-than-life characters of various kinds. Hun Sen's clearly an example, Duterte's an example, Thaksin's an example. And around those people, politics starts to be organized rather than around ideas, political parties, or other kinds of divides. There may be other kinds of divides, but the divides to a large extent are animated and driven by these big personalities. Now, many people in this room are political scientists or have studied politics and like to analyze politics from some sort of framework and perspective based on reading and thinking. A faculty like this, the school of which I teach in Leeds, we're really dedicated to understanding things like institutions, political parties, mechanisms, how power is organized. What are we supposed to do when increasingly these things become less important? Where you've got the big personalities who are connecting directly to people, to voters, without using intermediary institutions and mechanisms of the kind that we study. We have countries that are being run by Twitter. We have direct lines of communication in both directions, but particularly the capacity of the big personalities to get attention very easily. Now, I have written an article about mediated populism. I didn't invent this phrase. I'm not totally responsible for it. So what are we going to call it? Okay. Okay, that's what I think the best one we could come out with. But I've been arguing with a couple of my Thai colleagues about these words, and if someone would like to give us a better definition of a translation of mediated populism, there are people in this room who might be able to come up with that. What is mediated populism? The problem is you're going to ask me what populism is, and then that's just several hours of very boring lectures in itself. So let's try to skip that. And the other problem is that in Thailand, populism became the policies of the Thaksin governments from 2001 to 2006. So we can't really distinguish. Well, as soon as we've said Prasha Niyom, it's just become this very loaded and Thai-specific word, which doesn't help us very much with understanding this stuff. So mediated populism, in my view, is about a mode of communication whereby these politicians, particularly the aforementioned big personality type politicians, they really collapse all the conventional distinctions that we study. We used to think that, you know, a press conference is a press conference. A political rally is a political rally. An election campaign is an election campaign. And running the country is running the country. But it can turn out that actually all of these things are one and the same, or we can't clearly distinguish between them. We also see people, Sonti Limtunkun is kind of the one who starts it, switching between being media practitioners and being politicians. And then we have, you know, three major leaders of the red shirt movement who start off being on TV as commentators and comedians mocking other politicians, and then themselves become rally protest leaders and then become MPs and then become ministers. So this is, to me, the kind of the mediated populism, the way people pass through different incarnations through media and operate at different modes at different times, or sometimes at the same time. And we see this, of course, with a phenomenon whereby a protest movement comes out of a political party, or a protest movement can, as we're seeing again in Thailand now, generate a new political party which is in some way articulating the goals of the protest through parliamentary means. Okay. So where do the elections come into this? Well, we still have to have elections, and this is the thing that's slightly mysterious. Why doesn't Hun Sen say, you know, CPP has been running the country forever, for the past 30 years. We're not ever going to let anybody else run the country, because frankly, had CNRP won the election, had they been allowed to contest and won the election in 2018, very few of us believe that Hun Sen would have stepped aside and let Sam Rainsy and Kem Sokha take over. Is he going to move his stuff out of that huge Prime Minister's office building, which you might have seen in the middle of Phnom Penh? I seriously doubt it, right? So why doesn't Hun Sen just say, let's forget about this election stuff? Why does he go through the huge performance of staging an election, having banned the main opposition party, and then announcing, oh, surprise, surprise, we've won not just control of Parliament, but every single seat in Parliament? What is the point of that? Why would the military in Thailand keep saying, we're going to have elections soon, coming soon, coming soon? Why don't they just say, well, we're not going to have elections for a while. Let's just take a break from elections for 5 years or 10 years, and then we'll see you later. So let's just check out on that theme. We're running the show for now. Why didn't they say in 2014, we're going to stay in power for 5 years? Let's just put elections on hold. But they didn't do that. They kept saying, no, coming soon, it's going to be a few more months, next year, end of next year, beginning of the following year, and we're still in this game. So what is it about elections that still seems to be powerful when we know that elections might not decide who's actually in power? Other things, courts, the military, and so on, could be actually deciding who's in power. What we also see across the region is authoritarian nostalgia. It's very evident in the context of the Philippines, where people are talking about the Marcos time as being a great time. It's rather odd when people start telling me how good the economy was under Marcos. I had to rush back to Google and check that what I thought was correct, and that actually the Philippine economy completely collapsed under Marcos. But you'll find it hard to get people to engage with that discussion now, because we're not really talking about facts here. We're talking about nostalgia. Nostalgia should be something that we remember. Like, I can be nostalgic for my first ever visit to Thammasat University in 1991, when I first went upstairs to those rooms up there and knocked on people's doors, and I met Ajahn Gasian and so on. I can feel nostalgic for that because it actually happened, right? But this is a nostalgia for something that never happened. Most of the people who are nostalgic for Marcos or Suharto weren't born during that time, or were so young they can't remember it. So this is nostalgia for an idea. And then the facts that they're remembering are actually all wrong, but it doesn't really matter. So there's an authoritarian nostalgia where people become very attached to the idea of military rule, or of martial law, or strongman rule. And yet that naturally leads them to be very sympathetic to repressive solutions. Okay, another theme: struggles by minorities and outlying regions in the face of over-centralization. In this sort of polarized politics, authoritarian, majoritarian, then people whose faces don't fit for one reason or another are going to be relatively excluded from whatever it is that's going on. And there's not much space for discussion. People were asking me when I spoke at NIDA on Monday, what happened to all the discussion about decentralizing power to the South? Nobody seems to want to talk about that kind of thing anymore. Okay, here's one of my pictures from Duterte's final rally in Luneta Park 2 years ago. What we got here is a blurring of boundaries that occurs between media and political actors. As I say, we used to think that media are media, and the job of media is to report what is going on, and political actors are the ones who actually carry out the action. That has become less and less obviously the case in recent years, as we see a collapse of distinction between the two and people crossing over from one to another. It's almost becoming that you need to be a media celebrity in order to be a politician. Do you become the media celebrity after you enter politics, or do you already have some kind of cachet of media celebrity that allows you to enter politics? We're seeing this again in Thailand right now with what's going on. And the competition for the election that's coming up, it's not just about preparing policies or recruiting party members or selecting candidates. It's about trying to get the initiative in terms of media attention and how to manage that, how to stage your presence in such a way that you're going to be able to exert political influence later. The other thing that's interesting is that democracy, participation, citizenship, all this stuff keeps coming up, but without a great deal of content. So we find, I should have shown you another of my pictures, which is PDRC protesters preventing the ballots being counted at the district office next to my former apartment building in Payatai. But all in the name of democracy. People are against elections in the name of democracy. People are against elected governments in the names of citizenship and participation. We see these kinds of themes coming up again and again with different variants around the region, that everybody is supporting the rhetoric of democracy, participation, and citizenship. But when you really start to look at what democracy, participation, and citizenship mean, it often doesn't seem to be what those of us who took some introductory classes in political science a few years ago thought that those things meant. They've taken on different kinds of meanings. Okay, and here's the bit that is perhaps most difficult to understand and analyze. Well, I'm conscious I'm right here on Facebook Live, so I'm part of new modes of social media. When I last spoke at Thammasat University, there was no such thing as Facebook Live, and it wasn't possible to do this sort of stuff. So the ways in which, and that was only like 5 or 6 years ago, so things are changing very, very fast. The modes by which we communicate are changing very fast. And obviously, there's been lots of discussion about this. We had the high watermark of sort of cyber optimism around the Arab Spring. The internet is going to enable us to be more involved in politics, to bring down authoritarian regimes. There'll be more transparency. To some extent, this is true. But funnily enough, even if you can collect a whole load of pictures of people wearing expensive watches that they can't really explain, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily removed from office. Quite a few months later, the story continues to rumble on. So social media can do certain things, but it doesn't necessarily have the power to transform society in the way that we imagine. The other thing is that we tend to think of social media as, you know, people are empowered to be journalists and they can make their own comments and they can participate and they opened up space. But what we forget is that a lot of what appears on social media is actually reposted from mainstream media, from newspapers or from TV. And to me, everything in Thailand started with partisan TV. I remember, and I don't have to be as old as I am to remember this, most of you can remember, when Thai TV news was just unbelievably boring. And there was no excitement at all. It was just incredibly bland. And that all changed when we got partisan TV, starting with ASTV, and then the red counters to that, and then Blue Sky TV, and it became a 24-hour excitement, 24-hour emotion, 24-hour attacks on the other side, And then that kind of culture spilled over into from electronic media into social media. And the same kind of phenomenon we can see in many other countries around the region, that partisan TV is actually, on partisan radio, of course, as if you ride around in any taxis in Bangkok, you often end up listening to some of that. These partisan electronic medias then fuel the rise of partisan social media. I confess that I'm not on Facebook. I don't really engage very much with social media. I try. I like people not really to know exactly where I am. I guess today everybody knows where I am, but keeping a low profile has something to be said for it. I know it's a deeply unfashionable notion. But what I understand is that if you use these social media platforms, this is one of the big controversies recently, the more you like certain kinds of things, the more of the same kind of things you will get. And so people who have different kinds of political opinions will find a self-reinforcing logic to the information that they receive as a result. And this is what already happens when you just watch one TV station from morning till night, as I found happened here during the sort of the height of the red-yellow episodes. What we also see, and one of my colleagues at Leeds, Jason Cabanas, did a fantastic report about this, is manipulation of social media. In the Philippines, there are people who are literally manufacturing all kinds of pro-Duterte stories who are on somebody's payroll, we don't know exactly, sending out all sorts of messages into the ether, which seem to be generated by real people, but are actually generated by, you know, a few dozen guys who are very geeky computer guys who are earning a lot more money doing that than working in call centers, and are not necessarily themselves particularly interested in politics at all, but they're very excited by what they can do with the technology. And they're interviewed in Jason's report, which is you can find online. It's just a fantastic piece of work. So all this kind of stuff is going on, and people have been asking me the last couple of days, will this happen in Thailand in the election next year? I think the answer is probably yes, something along those lines. If it's not happening already, it might well start happening. Okay, this is taking us back to a book I did a number of years ago. What we've seen is intensive contestations for power and regime change. I think the alarming bit right across the region, as the rhetoric ramps up and the contestation and the polarization ramps up. I mean, we want some contestation. We don't want everybody to have the same idea. The problem is when contentious politics becomes so contentious that we start descending into violence. And here I'm in your, very much in your area, Jan, so you should jump in and critique me later or now if you like. But what I think is very worrying is right across the region, this kind of undertone of darkness. I'd actually just finished giving a version of the same talk in Bandung, and I got back to Jakarta, and right outside my hotel were the Indonesian presidential candidates just got their official designation of being candidates and their numbers on Friday. So they got number 2 for Prabowo, which was the number Jokowi got last year. So they kind of felt like they got something over on Jokowi, sorry, last time. And they were all wearing black in these kind of dark militaristic uniforms, looking like paramilitaries, basically, outside my hotel with a big loudspeaker van and motorbikes and getting extremely excited. And I started to feel like it's almost 11 o'clock at night, and this is a little bit creepy. With the Philippine election, it was even more obvious. Duterte campaigned with the slogan, change. Sounds good, right? Like Obama, change, the audacity of hope. Not really. In Duterte's case, change is coming. Sounds slightly worrying, right? Change is coming. The bad thing, though, was that not only was it change is coming, but when you see the poster, which, sorry, I failed to put that into this particular PowerPoint. Change is coming with a fist. Your face is going to be smashed if you stand in the way of this change which is coming when Duterte comes to power. If you are a drug dealer or on the wrong side politically or whatever it is, if you're a senator who says critical things about Duterte, you're going to be arrested, as the guy was just yesterday. After hiding out in his office in the Senate building for a few weeks, he finally had to go to jail. So change is coming, but the change is coming with a fist punching into your face. There's that threat of violence associated with change. I think this is one of the edgier and more alarming things about the political polarization that's taking place now, that there's this kind of threat, implicit threat somewhere, that if you go too far or you challenge what's going on, something could happen. Then, of course, we always have unmentionable actors. What's the military up to? Monarchy, of course. I won't go into a great deal of depth here since we're in Thailand, but you've all read my article. Or you can do. I'll send it to you if you want to read about it. I'm still standing by network monarchy. Thailand is not, never has been, and never will be a deep state, and I'll end there with that aside. Definitely not a deep state in any way, shape, or form. But clearly, what's going on is changing, and we can't talk about it. And it's just one example of a culture of rumors. Sorry, I keep flipping between British and American spelling. I should have changed that to OUR there for this, since I'm now on the University of Leeds payroll this month. I get very confused about switching between British and American English. But rumor and defamation are so widespread. I was talking in Indonesia. I said, well, I hear there are a lot of rumors in Thailand and the Philippines. Do you have rumors in Indonesia as well? And everyone said, yeah! And I didn't even get out of the room for the first lecture for people waylaying me and telling me all kinds of absolutely crazy rumors about what's supposedly going on with Indonesian presidential politics. So once you have a high level of rumor and also a culture of defamation, which has been encouraged, I believe that a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have what I call a defamation culture. Is that people really seem to appreciate insulting each other, especially when they can insult each other anonymously. When I first came to Thailand a few years ago, I was just wandering around the Sanam Luang taking pictures. And when I first came to Thailand a few years ago, I would wander around the Sanam Luang and there would be benches. The benches all seem to have gone. But there would be benches, and on the benches you'd find these baibliu, these leaflets saying, oh, did you know that General so-and-so did this, or that this MP from this party is doing that, and blah, blah, blah. Then when I was doing field work in the 1990s, when I was affiliated with this faculty at different newspapers in Thailand, like Matishon and Thairat, we'd gone into fax machine mode. And if you went over to the fax machine, you came in at first thing in the morning, and sometimes I was the first person in, and I would think, how many faxes came in overnight? Piles of faxes, all along the lines of these baibliu, anonymous faxes. Now we don't need a fax machine, and we can't put anything in Sanam Luang if we want to, but we don't need a physical leaflet or a fax. It's all just going out on social media. And the anonymity of it, of course, Bangkok has far more Facebook users than people, which means that most of these Facebook users are using different names. When Facebook talks about getting rid of fake accounts, I just wonder how they're going to get rid of 17 million fake Thai accounts just for starters. It's going to be quite a big challenge. But the proliferation of anonymous electronic media makes so many things possible. Okay. All right. I think the last point's fairly obvious. Done that one. Yep. Jokowi versus Prabowo. Yeah, I was kind of surprised that Jokowi agreed to take this picture. Prabowo famously, during the election campaign last time, rode into stadium on a horse during his campaigning. Slightly reminiscent of Mussolini, I think. I always told my students he was riding on a white horse, and then I realized that was wrong. I couldn't find a picture of Prabowo on a white horse. I did a lot of online searching. If anyone can find a picture of Prabowo on a white horse, please send it to me. But what I discovered is that he tricked Jokowi into getting onto a white horse instead. He after the election, invited Jokowi to Bogor to his ranch and got Jokowi to sit on a white horse. If he'd had good media advisors, they'd have told him, don't get on that horse and don't take this picture. But there we go. So both of them were accused of kind of populism, Jokowi appealing more to the urban poor, and Prabowo with this sort of baggage from the authoritarian New Order, strongman kind of image from the time of Suharto. Okay, I didn't have here the... okay. Oh, all right, we're going all the way around again. All right, let's start again, sorry. Getting confused. This is Mac, I don't really understand about that. Yeah, okay. No, it's not Mac, but it's, yeah. Okay. Looks like it, because it's white. Okay. I don't have the slide here, but very interesting data shows that the more educated people were and the higher their income, the more likely they were to vote for Prabowo, the human rights abusing general from the New Order. As people got more educated and better off, they did not become more liberal, progressive, and critical in their political thinking. Quite the opposite. People identified, better educated people identify with Prabowo, who speaks English well, who presents himself as cosmopolitan and sophisticated, despite riding on a horse into a stadium. And they thought that Jokowi was a kind of provincial, banal, guy who didn't really have what it took to be the president of Indonesia. That's an interesting kind of phenomenon too. Okay, can we find... Yes, this stuff is, we've pretty much talked about polarizing nature of elections, political parties getting in some ways less important. What we need is a narrative, a story. Everybody now has to be a storyteller because it's about emotions and it's about getting people to listen. I had a feeling that a certain Mr. T was going to be elected president in the United States a year before the election when I read an article in The Guardian which was entitled, "I Can't Even Tell My Wife." Secret Trump supporters explain their political preferences. And I can't even tell my wife. All kinds of very improbable people were explaining that they had this kind of hankering to support a particular presidential candidate, but they obviously couldn't tell anybody else about it. These included, a Muslim woman from the East Coast, a gay rights activist from the Midwest, or people you just would not expect to be in that camp, were explaining how secretly they had this hankering. So what we've increasingly found with polls is people don't want to admit their political preferences. When I asked friends in the UK, are you going to vote to leave the European Union or to stay in? When they started saying, I don't know, I haven't decided yet, that's when I knew actually they're going to vote to leave the European Union. They haven't decided means they don't want to tell me. Maybe they don't want to tell themselves. Maybe they don't want to admit to themselves what they're going to do. But when they go into the privacy of that ballots, the polling station, the ballot boxes in front of them, they're just going to mark X in the wrong place as a way of sending a message. Somebody very close to me, I asked a person very close to me, why did you vote for Brexit? To teach David Cameron a lesson. Well, we taught David Cameron a lesson. David Cameron's gone. We're stuck with the consequences of your action for the next 50 years. This is the problem here. Okay. So, really, it's all about connecting with the voters emotionally and not about anything else. And you can't believe that you're entitled to anything as a politician. Just because you've been around for a long time, like Hun Sen, people could turn against you if someone else can get a better story than your story. So you better make sure your story's good. And if your story's not good enough, you're going to have to find a way of stopping other people's stories being heard, because there's no other way for you to win if you're going to continue with elections. Okay, do we have any points of optimism? Well, we can talk about new parties in Thailand. There's a few new parties to talk about. I talked about more of them yesterday. Sorry, here I'm only mentioning one, but if you came to Chula yesterday, I talked about a lot more. But the one everybody keeps talking to me about is this one. One of the leading figures in it is an Ajahn in a faculty not very far from here. So you can start a new party which has a lot of appeal to younger voters with a kind of liberal, progressive sort of branding and appeals to minorities. The question then is this really going to work? Is this an effective way of competing electorally? Because what I found from students of mine who worked with me at Leeds who studied electoral politics on the ground in much more depth than I've ever been able to do is without local organization, you can't win in a constituency, and this new system, this MMA system, requires you to win in a constituency. So people don't get to vote for Thanaton or Future Forward per se. They have to be voting for the local candidate of the party, and their votes will be transferred into a party list. But you don't have what you used to have, which is that, well, I really like Apisit, so I'm going to vote the party list for him, but actually I'd prefer for my local one to have the Purtai guy. Because a lot of people are splitting their vote, saying, well, 50-50, a bit of this, a bit of that. We give one to them, we give one to them, and it's going to come out good, right? But this kind of very, dare I say, kind of common Thai way of thinking, like sharing out the cake with the ballot papers, can't be done anymore under this MMA system. And that could be difficult for these parties. The other problem is if young voters, like a lot of people here, are enthusiastic about your party, that might not help you very much, because what we found with Brexit is they didn't show up. Nobody under 25 wanted to leave the European Union, and most people over 25 didn't go to vote. So the people over 75 decided the future of those under 25 for them and bequeathed this disaster to their grandchildren. So this is a problem. Can you actually, if Future Forward got a lot of excitement from younger voters, which may be the case, does that translate into anything? And then the other positive story of 2018, Mahathir? Fantastic, yes, okay. The appalling Najib was out. Probably he's heading for jail soon. Anwar's out of jail. Mahathir's never been in jail. He just sends people to jail. Mahathir, of course, claimed he would be Prime Minister for a very short time. I never believed that. I think they'll have to take him out of the Prime Minister's office in a wooden box. But it takes an old autocrat to bring down the ruling party, and in many ways, Mahathir is an architect of the system that Najib benefited from. Is this a model that can be generalized? I asked people in Indonesia, if Suharto was still alive, would you like to bring him back to run Indonesia again? Nobody actually said yes. But, you know, Marcos' son is likely to come back, and he's kind of Marcos light. He's Marcos without any of the intellectual capacity that Ferdinand Marcos, the original one, had. So that's a pretty depressing thought. So is what happened in Malaysia democracy or a variant on authoritarian nostalgia? So we've got elements of authoritarianism that revisited, these crackdowns, the Ahok case in Indonesia, what's going to happen, the rerun of the election there. Burma, obviously depressing. We thought we had a choice between the military and the civilian government. Turns out it wasn't a real choice. Could Duterte be followed by Bongbong Marcos? That would be very depressing. Could the military remain in power in Thailand even after the election? Because this is what I talked about yesterday at Chula. If you get 126 votes in the lower house and you've got the votes of the Senate voting en bloc, then actually a party such as Puratai could win 300 seats but still not be able to get their person selected as Prime Minister if the game was played in that way. How you run the country as Prime Minister with only 126 seats in the Parliament or less than a majority is another question, but it's happened before. Mahathir's party isn't very big. These things can be done, so we don't know. So the overall theme here, the last book I wrote was called Mapping National Anxieties, and since then I've found so many depressing examples of national anxieties all over the place, ranging from the UK to different parts of Southeast Asia. These are just big themes. Manipulating collective fears, political space contracting. Nevertheless, I still think there's some resistance. I don't think it's all going the way of darkness. I see signs of optimism. Next year could be a turning point. We could have elections again in Thailand and some kind of pushback against authoritarianism. We could have a positive outcome in Indonesia, which probably isn't a human rights abusing former Suharto general becoming president, riding into the presidential palace on either a white horse or a brown horse. That would be, from my point of view, pretty dark. So I'm still optimistic. I'm more optimistic here than I am about Britain because I don't know what we're going to do. None of our major parties want to give us a second referendum, and we're not even confident if we got a second referendum we could change the outcome. But most of the political leaders in this region will be up for re-election. They'll have to account to somebody sooner or later before very long, and there are always possibilities of change, and we can see new progressive forces trying to emerge and new critical, interesting things happening. So I'm not without hope, but I have to say that fear is also something that I'm not without. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. You always giving a colorful and fascinating talk, and so you talk about many themes that emerged in Southeast Asia in the past few years. Rise of big personalities. Election is important, but not decide who's gonna have power. authoritarianism, nostalgia, and people tend to support a strong man, and repressive solution over centralization and the struggle of minorities, and also the rise of the partisan mode of social media, and also many other sub-themes. And I like where you contrast both the politics of hope and fear that emerging in the region. So I think now it's time for Q&A. Professor Duncan has touched upon several issues on several countries. I think feel free to answer the questions or the questions to the extent that he can answer. Because he's in Thailand.
Yeah, right.
Any questions, comments? I will collect few questions, perhaps 2 or 3 per round, and then we'll let Duncan answer. And before you ask the questions or giving comments, please introduce yourself. 1, 2, okay, please.
Good afternoon, Professor Duncan. Thank you very much for coming to Thailand today and to I would like to ask, first of all, I'm Dr. Warawadi Estrich, CEO of Humans Thailand Project. I would like to ask Professor Duncan that during the past 4 years, have you been followed the military government, whether their work that actually suits the people, actually answer the people's lives? And can you answer that, please? Thank you.
Okay. Next, please.
Hello, my name is Henry Woodland. I'm from the School of Oriental and African Studies. I'm an absolute fan. I'm really sorry for such a fanboy. In your research, Professor Duncan, how much consideration do you give to the soft power enactment from China? Do you think it's relevant in this discourse?
Okay.
2 big questions.
Oh my, yes. All right. Yeah, well, I think people who've been living here for the past 4 years will have much more information than I do, because I'm in the privileged position of just popping in and out for weeks or, days or weeks, or occasionally about a month at a time. And I haven't had a chance to have an extended period of time. I think it's, I talk to a lot of people and I travel around the country a lot. If we could fly magically up to Isan, to the kind of places I go to, I think there are places I could take you to, or we could go to together, where it'd be very hard to find anybody who had a good word to say about the government. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in many parts of the country. At the same time, I know other people who tell me that really things are going well, that the economy is doing well, that there are some very capable people running the government. So I think it's really partly a matter of where you're coming from. From my point of view, from a political perspective, I'm concerned about these questions about people's rights and opportunities, and I would have liked to see an election by now, and if we weren't going to have an election by now, I'd have liked to see a lifting of a lot of restrictions so that people could at least have more open debates. Because part of the problem is the question that you ask is a question that's very hard for people in Thailand to talk about openly, because space for these kind of discussions is difficult to find. And I guess that's, as a political scientist, that's my primary concern in all this. But yeah, I get so many different points of view from different people, and I'm just trying to process all the different reactions I have. I mean, I talked to somebody who's a minister in government who told me, you just can't believe how incompetent and useless the other ministers in the cabinet are. And then I talk to people who say, actually, having been watching these ministers, I met someone yesterday who said, I've been watching all the government ministers very closely for the past few months, and I'd say their performance is at least as good as that of, the previous couple of governments, the Yingluck government or the Abhisit government. So faced with the choice, I might even decide to support these people. So I get every kind of answer to the question, and it's not for me to say which is right, but I tend to think that a little more opening up would be the kind of thing I'd be looking for. Yeah, I've always tried to avoid the great power stuff. That's the IR stuff. I get very uncomfortable with trying to read what's going on through those lenses. Actually, Ajahn Gosien gave a very good keynote lecture at the Euroseas conference in Oxford last year, talking about some of those questions, and he can talk about it much better than I can. But well, I tend to see things like this. I feel like people in Thailand never wanted to be colonized by my own country or by France, even if in certain respects elements of colonization did come in. Was Thailand ever colonized? Question. I don't think they really want to be dominated by any other country either, whether it's the US or China. So although it might be true that a government like this government might be more sympathetic to China than governments have been in the past, if we look at things like the Belt and Road initiatives and the railway lines, it hasn't gone nice and smoothly as people might have imagined. If this government was being kind of excessively sympathetic to China, you'd have expected all that stuff to be well under construction, if not finished by now, over these past 4 years. So it's never quite as simple as people would like to believe. I think there's been a lot of playing off of one side against another, which is a kind of a long-standing tradition of how these things are conducted. But I'm not the best person to ask about this stuff, because I try not to do this stuff. I believe that Southeast Asia operates, based primarily on domestic, that each country has its own specific domestic conditions, which are the primary drivers of its politics, and I don't believe that, I don't think foreigners have much influence in Thailand. There are some countries where foreigners are more influential, but I don't feel like foreigners are nearly as influential as they might want to imagine themselves here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, 1, 2, any other questions? Okay, another question. Okay, please. You can use a microphone.
Close enough.
I think they can't hear at the back, that's the thing, yeah.
So if the politics of each country is driven by idiosyncratic factors, why then to identify these collective trends that we've seen across countries? Surely there are trends that appear across very different countries from time to time. Do they have a common cause, or is it just a confluence of different factors that are just help us to get out?
Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting question, please.
So I'm here from Thailand.
Good.
So according to your team, politics of hope and fear. So
yeah.
I would like to hear your perspective. Which group of people do you think that they are scarier? A group of people who give hope to people, or a group of people who make people fear?
Thank you.
Before the winning politics, how do we go about evaluating behaviour in Thailand then, if we're not relying on those political ideas? Instead, we have to have a new framework of understanding. That question makes sense. Thank you very much.
Well, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, the questions aren't getting easier. Let me see if I can explain this. So when I say that I'm a big believer in essentially domestic explanations for what's going on within individual countries in Southeast Asia, that doesn't mean that I'm not using a comparative perspective. And as you picked up from the talk, it's absolutely a comparative talk. So I would quibble with the word idiosyncratic. I didn't use the word idiosyncratic. That was your word, not mine. So I'm not saying that the things taking place here are idiosyncratic, but what's clearly the case is that a number of countries in the region share certain commonalities in the way that their politics is emerging. Some of the commonalities are driven by things that are beyond one particular country, like the rise of social media. The rise of social media is a very clear example of that. So there are certain kinds of phenomenon. I think another phenomenon is the nature of a very rapidly changing society. I haven't talked in this talk about urbanized villages, but I'm interested in what happens in countries where there's a kind of creative tension between the city and the countryside. People tend to assume famous former dean of this faculty argued that Thailand had two democracies. There was the urban democracy and the rural democracy. And I've challenged that in some of the things I've been writing, and I've talked about urbanized villages. In other words, that there are huge numbers of people in Thailand, and this applies to Cambodia and it applies to other countries in the region too, who are registered to vote in quote-unquote the countryside, but actually they're working right here on this campus or just outside. They're people who are supposedly in the northeast, but are actually in Bangkok most of the time. So when you get a kind of identity schizophrenia, to use a rather overblown phrase, where people are neither rural nor urban, but maybe both urban and rural, they have a dual understanding of their identity and their relationship with the society and the state, I think that produces a certain kind of potential for destabilization, which can facilitate polarized politics. And we see it in Thailand, we see it in Cambodia. Colleagues who work on Malaysia have said that you could apply a similar kind of interpretation to Malaysia. In the Philippines, of course, you've got vast numbers of people not living in the country, outside the country. Indonesia has its own complexities, but you'll find parallel phenomenon if you go to major cities in Indonesia. There are huge numbers of people who don't come from those cities and have migrated there very, very recently. So I think there are trends like this, the social media, and then the massive physical dislocation of populations produced by this disjuncture between where the work is and where people originally come from and continue to identify with. I think these things that are common in the countries fuel polarization. But have I got all this worked out? Definitely not. I would like, some of you to come and do a PhD thesis at Leeds or ANU or some other great university and work on this stuff, because I think there's an awful lot going on here that we are not beginning to figure out. And that kind of allows me to segue. Let me just skip your question a minute and go to the last question, which is, yeah, we need new ways of working. I think people who've been studying politics are actually a bit stuck now, because the tools that we've been using, our understanding of what's a political party, what's a voter, what's a voting decision, how do we find out people's opinions by polling them, a lot of the basic stuff doesn't really work anymore to explain what's going on in Western countries, let alone Southeast Asia. Possibly never did explain what was going on in Southeast Asia, but it really, really doesn't now. So we've got to find a new way of doing this. For me, the new way of doing it is always to go back to the field and find an inductive approach and go to the data and let the data lead us somewhere, rather than trying to wheel in a paradigm and go and test it. But that's just the way it's the only way I've ever figured out how to work. But yeah, I don't have an answer coming out with these hybridized terms like mediated populism or network monarchy or urbanized villages and so on. Basically, you take an oxymoron and you bottle it, and you start from there. So you take your oxymoron and then go and do some field work and see what you can find that relates to it, that elucidates the oxymoron. You might be able to tell that my original training was in English literature, and I never really got past that thinking in a slightly odd way about how to understand politics. So I don't have the answer to your question, but I see how we could form perhaps the basis of answers by this kind of approach. Who's more scary? That's a very interesting question. Actually, I'd love to ask you what you think about your own question. But yes, of course, offering hope could be itself frightening. Yeah. Because the people who are offering us hope could be offering us hope for the wrong reasons. In the end, I think people who talk the language of fear are still more frightening for me. I think Duterte with his fist smashing into your face is scarier than anything else. A politics that's really based on an idea of being menacing and threatening violence overtly. But I mean, you're quite right that even people who are talking in a softer way may be actually getting round to the same point by another route. Oh, that's true.
Some questions of my own, but I will save it for later.
Okay.
So next round, one, James. Okay, 3 questions. Please.
Thank you, Professor McCargo, for your fascinating lecture. My name is Purawit Patanasut. I am a PhD student at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and I am a former student here at this faculty.
Great.
I have a question about the 2017 Constitution. It aims to create a type of guided democracy, or if we borrow Ajahn Prajak's term, the military guided semi-authoritarianism. But to me, guided democracy is nothing new in Thai politics. The attempts of the military to retain the power after the coup, we have seen it from 1968, 1978, 1981, and 2007 Constitution, and it eventually proved that it failed at the end. My question is, from your point of view, why the military junta at this time still think that it will work? Thank you.
Yeah.
James.
James Wise, I'm a former diplomat now working on. I just wonder if your views on questions of governance. A lot of what you've spoken about, and a lot of the discussion, region, as you said, is about elections. Will there be elections? What's the value of elections? About political diplomacy. To what extent is there discussion about governance towards law? There was here in the 1990s, prompted by the events of 1992, was an institution, again, post-crisis. The country I'm thinking of at the moment where perhaps there is some discussion about governance is Malaysia. With your travels, through your experience, to what extent do you see an absence, as far as I see it, of discussion about governance, part of the problem?
Okay, thank you. On governance. Okay, last question.
Hi, I'm Natatida Pongshik. I was a former student here, and I'm now a master's student at the University of Leeds. So, yeah.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah. So, this might not be related to the field of political trends in Southeast Asia, but I'd like to ask your opinion. So, do you think the change of the government in the next election would affect the situation or the policy towards the Deep-South conflict? Thank you.
Okay. Another area of your expertise, Southern conflict.
Yes.
Okay, Duncan.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thanks very much for these questions. Yeah, I can't help being reminded, because I was doing my PhD research in Bangkok in 1991, which is when I first came to this faculty, and I can't help feeling a sense of deja vu with all this. We're forming a new party backed by the military, which is going to possibly invite the coup leader to become prime minister. I mean, this is just so eminently similar to, you know, Suchinda and 1991-2 period. So I really hope we're not in a replay of that particular dark episode of history, because we know that Suchinda lasted as prime minister for precisely 48 days, and that he was ousted by mass protests, which culminated in violence, and dozens of people were killed very close to here, right in front of this university. So we all have these kinds of things in our minds when we start to look at these sorts of scenarios. Is it going to be any different this time? Clearly, conditions are different. Nothing is exactly the same as it was. But yeah, you'd have thought we'd have moved on from the idea that people wanted to stay on in power after a military coup. We kind of thought that the lesson of 1992 was, well, some of us hope the lesson of 1992 was no more military coups, but if the lesson of 1992 isn't no more military coups, it's the come in for a year and bail out quickly, a la Sonti and Surayut 2006-7. The problem is that doesn't seem to be the lesson that's been taken to heart here. We've got a different kind of lesson. The lesson was, last time we were too soft, and this time we really, really have to get it right. But that begs the question of whether there's been enough done actually really, really to get it right. And, you know, we don't know. Yesterday I was showing a lot of maps of voting patterns in different recent Thai elections and in the referendum in 2016. We don't have all the data because we haven't been able to do, there have been no new elections, and we haven't been able to get really good convincing data. But it doesn't seem like the polarization has gone away. The polarization is still there. And if the polarization is still there, then That's a problem because the coup was staged in 2014 to get rid of the polarization. And if the election demonstrates that the polarization still exists, then we have to ask ourselves what the coup has accomplished. And that's a real question. And then, well, James, yes, of course. Well, what we're supposed to have, as we will remember, is reform before election. We're supposed to be in a process of reform. And, we've had a government that had absolute power for the last 4+ years. And you'd have thought that if there are some problems, whether it's, problems with the police force, as we keep being told, or problems with dodgy taxi drivers at Suvarnabhumi Airport, that problems with the education system that need reforming, possibly drastically, you'd have thought this time of absolute power would have been a good time to grapple with those governance questions. And actually, despite all the talk of reform, we seem to have had very little enthusiasm for actually doing anything about it. The reform has been put off into this 20 years from now kind of plan, rather than, okay, we're going to be in power for a limited period of time, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which we might not have agreed with, but it would have had a logic to it. So that's the interesting thing. Even in a period without elections, we've had a government that seems to be not interested, or not as interested as we expected in the governance problems, and more in just postponing elections than and continuing its own authority than anything else. And that's all rather odd. Yeah, well, as you know, I spent a lot of time studying the 1997 Constitution and the political reform process and edited a book about that. And frankly, I've become very bored of looking at this stuff because I feel like it's not where the answer is, that what happens with these processes is they become hijacked by legalists, and whatever you think a new constitution is supposed to mean, somewhere down the line it's going to be challenged, it's going to be changed, or the institutions that are set up will develop their own internal contradictions and so on and so forth. So it would be nice if we could talk about governance, but certainly in the Thai case we don't seem to be there yet. There is some discussion in Malaysia. There is on-off. Duterte talks about federalism and changing the whole political system of the Philippines. So these things do come up. But with most of the big personalities, the larger-than-life politicians, it's not really about doing anything. It's about being there and being who you are. It's not actually about changing the state and society in the ways that you would imagine. And that's somewhat curious. And yes, good to see my former student back here at Thammasat again. And yes, and you took my class about the Deep South, so you are very well versed in the issue, or at least my views on the issue. I've always said that if people can't agree about national politics, then why couldn't they try to make progress with some issues like the issue in the South? Could you achieve some kind of agreement? The fact is, so far, the move toward, basically I believe that the situation in the South is a political problem, it's a legitimacy problem, and it's a problem of unrepresentative government, because the Malay Muslim majority of the 3 southern border provinces will only ever be a tiny minority in the national parliament, and the only way to give them more control over their own affairs is to decentralize power, whether you want to call it autonomy or you don't want to call it autonomy. So basically it's some kind of autonomy. With absolute power in Article 44, they could give autonomy to the South tomorrow. It would be a great parting gift from the NCPO before they move on. But there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm so far for that kind of thing, because we're still stuck with the idea that to give any area substantial decentralization or autonomy would be to give away Thai territory, which really isn't the case. So we continue to be, 21 years after 1997, in a situation where the people of Bangkok are the only people who've been electing their own provincial governor, and everybody else gets to have one who's sent from the Interior Ministry down the road. And that system is still in place. So to me, the possibility is there. Now, will things change after the election? The only party that pushed forward the agenda on the Deep South was Pheu under Yingluck. We can argue that they weren't necessarily completely sincere, or that their ideas were not very well thought out, but the fact is that the other parties never did anything in the direction of substantially talking about political solutions for the problem in the South. That said, in the event that Pertai were to be the largest party and were to be able to have their nominee selected as Prime Minister, it's hard to imagine that, given all the contentious politics that's been going on and all the pressures they would face and all the spotlights that would be on them, that, you know, pushing ahead with some kind of decentralization for the South is going to be one of the things they want to do in their first 100 days. I would really doubt it. So, unfortunately, I suspect that, you know, the country will continue to be consumed with its national level polarization for some time, and that whoever wins the election, you're probably not going to have progress. I hope I'm proved wrong. I hope there is some enthusiasm for sorting out this problem amongst whoever takes over the government next, but it's hard to see where that would come from right now.
I have some questions. After I ask question, I will collect questions from the floor. Okay. Since you're already here, so I try to gain wisdom from you as much as possible. So first question is, why not deep state?
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I know I put you on the spot.
That's fine.
And you don't have a full liberty to discuss this freely in Thailand. And
that's right.
Even we are progressive faculty, but we don't have a sovereignty over there.
No, right.
So, but I just want to hear, I mean, to the extent that you can explain what's the core argument that you think, okay, network monarchy still fit. Okay. The second point is about the middle class. You mentioned about in Indonesia, right? The educated people tend to support Prabowo. I also did field work in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, right? And I found a similar phenomenon that talking to people, scholars, journalists, inform me that middle class in their own country are turning more conservative. And if you also add the PDRC movement, the urban middle class in Bangkok, who boycott the election and had a slogan that if you love democracy, don't go to vote. So how you explain this phenomenon? Because I remember in 1990s, people quite hopeful about the role of the middle class in bringing about political change. Or publication about Southeast Asian politics. You have a student movement in Burma, 1992. You have our middle class uprising, right? That led to Dr. Anek Lao Chamathat books. And you have 1998, the fall of Suharto, the role of student and middle class. You have reformacy in Malaysia. So what went wrong, or what happened during these 2 decades that explain the shifting roles of the middle class? And last question is about Malaysia. So the broader question is, even you talk about the limitation of the election in deciding who gonna have power, but from the case of Malaysia, at least they can bring about the regime change. Or toppling down the UMNO. So is it possible that elections still be a platform for change, peaceful change in Southeast Asia? It's going to be, can Malaysia be a model? What have we learned, or what the lesson learned from the case of opposition victory, electoral victory in Malaysia?
Okay. All right. I said the questions weren't getting any easier, and now we're really getting there. Okay. Where do we start with the deep state? Okay. I'm trying to write an article now explaining why I'm right about this, and so I need to spend a bit of time conceptualizing that. I haven't fully worked it through. I did speak at Columbia in April at the Thailand update there, and I tried to summarize the argument, and people told me go away and write that up, but I haven't sat down and written it up yet. But basically, look, what I talked about in the theory of network monarchy, insofar as it's a theory or whatever you want to call it, is it's about a very loose notion of power, where power is not exercised hierarchically. You have groups of people who believe that they have been licensed to work in certain areas and that they can pursue their agendas with a kind of blessing, but they don't need any direct order or even signal in order to carry out. So basically it's a system of freelance power, or it's a system of kind of franchise power. You've delegated to, you've got military people, you delegated some things to some kind of legal fraternity, you've delegated some things to certain bureaucratic elements and to the judiciary and so on, and once they've been given their role, they don't need to consult anybody, nobody needs to tell them what to do, they can just get on and act because they believe that they're working under a big umbrella of a certain kind of ideological platform, and they believe that their personal loyalty is enough to validate the actions that they're carrying out, right? So that's the network monarchy argument, which maybe I didn't make clear enough, and some people, there are a lot of articles talking about my article which seem to go off in a different direction and don't, in my mind, relate to what I actually said in it, possibly because I myself have forgotten what I said in it, or possibly because the people didn't read it properly, or maybe they read it once and then they didn't go back and check. But that's the argument that I'm making. I never said that there was any kind of overarching, coordinating master plan in all this. So the deep state takes the kind of idea that, yes, there's this network out there, but then assumes that the network is, there's real agency driving the network. At the core of the network, there's somebody who's able to say, okay, you do this, you do that. So the Constitutional Court is singled out in Eugénie's article as being a focus of the deep state, and every action of the Constitutional Court is basically, seems to be happening on command, according to a predetermined script. When I looked at Constitutional Court cases, and my book about the politics of these court cases is going to come out soon, what I found is the Constitutional Court are all over the place, they keep contradicting themselves, they keep trying to avoid making decisions, they kept on and on postponing doing anything to bring down the Yingluck government. I do not see them in any way consistently following this line. Of course they did make decisions that went in a particular direction, but not in a highly coordinated way, as though somebody was telling them what to do, because I think half the time they didn't know what they were supposed to do, because they were getting confusing and ambiguous and contradictory signals in the atmosphere, and they were trying to muddle through. So I believe there's a great deal of muddling through going on in Thailand. Whether that's still the case now, I'm talking about up to 2016. Things now may be different, and I may have to reconceptualize everything, but certainly up to 2016, muddling through, ambiguity, nuance, confusion, these are the themes that I see. There's certain kinds of biases and tendencies and so on, but it doesn't amount to a deep state. And there's nothing in the deep state article that explains how this agency is being exercised, by whom it's being exercised, who is giving orders to who, and there are very, very few tangible examples. So I continue to be convinced that certainly to explain politics from, say, the mid-70s to 2016, the network monarchy argument is the most compelling argument, and that the deep state argument is over-simplistic and deterministic. But I need to write all this down with a lot of evidence rather than making sweeping assertions like this. But yeah, and I've said this to Eugénie, so it's nothing new here. We've been having this conversation for some years now. We're probably not going to agree anytime soon, but that's okay. That's what the academic debate is about. And if it's stimulating people in Thailand to think critically about these questions, whether they agree with me or not, it's all fine, because what we need is for people to try and figure out what's going on. What's going on is complicated and messy, and the more people try and do it, and the more people come back and criticize us and respond to us and take it in a different direction, I think the better it's going to be. That's what we're here for. Let's stir things up. Let's have some discussion rather than everything just being impossible. So we can discuss up to a point, and yeah. That's as far as I can go right here. But yeah, okay. The middle classes. Yeah, what happened? We all remember, Parsuk's book and other books. Everybody got excited about the middle classes in the early 1990s. They were supposed to be the great solution. We had the mobile phone mob, which was the characterization of the 1992 protests. And what happened to all that? Yeah, it fizzled away. I think part of the problem was once you see the the reality of quote-unquote democratization, which is it's not exactly democratization, but the empowerment of more people to participate electorally. If you're sitting in a capital city like this, and up to now, people who are not actually in the countryside, but you can characterize as being in the countryside, they might as well be, because they're not having much political impact, because they haven't had a sense of their own collective capacity to act politically. Therefore, voters who are registered to vote in the countryside, wherever they physically are, aren't acting as a collectivity in their own interests. Once voters are mobilized by a political party, like a pro-Thaksin party, to vote in something like their own interests, well, there's a lot more of them than there are the middle-class people in a place like Bangkok or in a city like Jakarta and so on. You're outnumbered. I think this is what, in the Jokowi versus Prabowo thing, the middle classes in a city like Jakarta are thinking, we're going to be outnumbered by all these people that Jokowi's going to bring in from East Java and from who knows where. They're going to have different interests from us, and we can't trust somebody who represents those different interests. So numerically, the middle classes are going to lose from democratization. And once they start fearing that, and fearing that they can't handle the reality of negotiating power and sharing power with people from other groups in society in other parts of the country, then they start to say, whoa, hang on a minute, we don't want this, we're going to try and stop this. And somewhat parallel processes happened in Britain in the 19th century, when voting was a franchise and you had to be property owner and so on, and then you came face to face with all these factory workers who've moved into cities like Leeds are going to have the vote, and they're not going to vote for the same people that you have been putting into parliament, and sooner or later they're going to get some concessions out of you, they're going to get better welfare, they're going to get you to pay more taxes and things like this. So there's a kind of logic to what happens to the middle classes as they wake up to the reality of this very messy quote-unquote democratic transition, one result of which is that they're going to have less power. They're going to have to share power with other people who have different interests, and there are far more of them. And you see the same thing in a place like Turkey and lots of other countries around the world. Malaysia, I talked a bit about Malaysia. Could it be a model? I just think it's, everybody I've talked to said without Mahathir they couldn't have done it. I don't know if they're right. I mean, I was talking to my Malaysian students at Columbia on the very day of the election, and they were saying, well, we really, really want Najib out. We've been rooting for, the opposition for years. We've sent in our votes and blah, blah, blah. I said, well, do you think he's going to be out? Not a chance. But even the people who were really, really against Najib thought that he would manage to pull it off again. The fact is that Mahathir still has an enormous amount of credit with elements of the Malaysian population. And once he was leading the charge, they were able to do it. So is it a personalized reversion to Mahathir's kind of old strongman image? I don't know. But if it is, then it can't easily be replicated, because there's no equivalent figure in Thailand, there's no equivalent figure in Indonesia, there's no equivalent figure in the Philippines. So, I don't know. But it's still, I listed it as one of my two, optimistic stories. I'm trying to be optimistic about it. It's the most positive thing possibly that's happened in Southeast Asia this year politically, even though it's a very odd story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. I don't know if I've satisfied you with my answers.
Thank you. All good answers. Yes. I asked about Malaysia because some of the journalists told me, I could not confirm it's true or not, that the Thai elite is quite concerned about what's happening in Malaysia,
yeah.
and the power of the voters,
yeah.
and the so-called the tsunami
right.
of
right.
the voters, that even
right.
the government,
yeah.
like UMNO, the government party control everything, the state apparatus,
yeah.
the election commission,
right.
but still
right.
they were outnumbered by the
right.
voters.
And that's why I say there's no entitlements anymore. People can't necessarily be controlled. And this is the strange, on the one hand you've got more authoritarianism, on the other hand the electoralism has its own momentum still, which can't be discounted. And that's why I'm still somewhat optimistic at the end, despite everything I'm talking about here. Yeah. Yeah. But of course they're also looking at Cambodia and thinking, that's a pretty good scenario. Yeah.
Totally opposite.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, any questions, comments? Okay. One, Ajahn Kasian, and okay, Chachada. Okay. Please.
My name is Duncan McCargo from Pressure Thai, an online news website.
Oh yeah.
I have a question that I would like to hear. The voice is not that good, but it's fine. I'd like to hear your comment about.
Can you step back a bit from the microphone because it's sort of yeah, that's the problem. You're too close to it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to hear your comment about the role of the social media in Thai election, the upcoming Thai election. Maybe the regulation or any lesson learned from the election from many countries, and or even Brexit itself. Thank you.
Okay. Role of social media in election. Ajahn Kasian.
I have a question. First, about the fact that the insecurity up until today, keep on delaying, postponing election. Would that fact reflect a situation in which install monist type of power regime, the fragmented society, among the fragmented elite, next to impossible? Since they could not find a way to install a monist type of power regime in such a fragmented society, and among the fragmented elite, they could see no way forward.
Right.
Postponing election.
Right.
As to the comments, I'm struggling by a subtitle of the talk, the politics of hope. And it reminds me of a long conversation I had with no friend of mine yesterday. We had lunch. Our relationship go back 40 years. When they call to call it time, comradeship.
Yeah.
So we have gone through a lot. And we think that, one uprising, two uprising, three uprising, there should be enough. But it doesn't end.
No.
So we become more or less tired, exhausted, and hopeless. And we have been trying to looking for some source of hope. And strangely enough, we find them in certain individuals. And I think of people like Lawyer Praveen who has just been released by the court just yesterday. There are, I think, 4 statements, long statements. Not only very prayerless of which contemplated myself, but it will become sure historic document. I'm thinking of people like people, young lady, who stand up again and again against the military regime for the rights and liberty of all people. I'm thinking of one of my students, Channing, who happened to be abducted in the middle of the night in front of Thammasat Rangsit campus by the military. So when we think of these people, I am too ashamed to be afraid. I'm too ashamed of some kind of duty. When we think of these people, go on. And the third point is the whole talk reminds me of animation TV series I watched recently, Batman. And it reminds me of Gotham City.
Yes.
Gotham City.
Yeah.
The place where Batman. It is under the rule of the print that is run by a spirit belief. The right hand manifesto happen to be a fixed. I cannot think of a better setup for the emergence of Batman.
Very interesting, so only Batman, not Batman versus Superman. That's another movie.
Right.
Okay, and Shashara.
I'm Shashara. Now I'm studying in master degree here. My question is, I think in Thailand there are some forces and supporters of the military regime. Not only military forces, but also bureaucrats from the old regime. And the most important, in my opinion, is the Thai Capital Group. As you can see, they work with the military regime, especially in the Pracharat policy and many committees. So what do you think about these actors in democratization in Thailand and the roles of them after we have a new government in next election? Because as we can see, some committee are still in the cabinet and the government after the election. Thank you.
Okay. All right. How to respond to all this? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on social media, and other people know much more about it than I do. As I say, there's reason to believe that there could be problems, given problems that have happened in other countries in the region and in developed countries, including my own. Regulation, I guess I get kind of nervous, because it seems like the government has quite a lot of regulation already, and you know, passing of new regulations, would it really be to ensure that social media isn't abused, or would it be to you know, channel things in a certain kind of political direction? So that's the problem. When you don't have much confidence in a lawmaking process or a regulatory process, it's very difficult to turn to regulation as a solution for serious problems. So in another context, we might be saying, yeah, a regulation would be great. But here, I'm just afraid that any regulation could turn out to be a double-edged sword of some kind. So I'm really nervous about calling for more regulation of media anywhere in Southeast Asia, actually, right now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to respond to your wonderful comments, John. Yeah, clearly, a major reason for repeated postponement of the election is because they can't figure out how to win. And yeah, that's basically what you're saying, I think. And it's difficult to see, because as far as I know, and I talk to people from different political parties, everybody's been doing their own polling, and the polling keeps showing that the result is going to be the wrong result. Pertai is likely to be the largest party. Even the rivals to Pertai told me, our polls show that Pertai is going to win the election, or at least be the largest party. So how are you going to fix the result when you've had 4.5 years of absolute power and people's minds don't seem to have changed that much? Maybe they changed a bit, maybe they changed 10%, maybe they changed 20%, but they didn't change dramatically in the way that they needed to in order for you to get what you said you were looking for. So there's this discrepancy between rhetoric and reality. And one of the reasons clearly for the repeated postponement is, well, just give it a bit more time. Coming soon, you know, very soon, everybody's going to see the light and realize that we're the good guys and those other guys are the bad guys, and then they would support us naturally and definitely. And it just isn't happening. Might be happening a bit, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. So that's a core problem. I mean, I absolutely agree that we have to end with a bit of hope, which I tried to end with a bit of hope. And yes, I met, quite by chance, one of the very same kinds of people that you're talking about, who came to see me yesterday when I wasn't expecting it. And we had a fascinating conversation. And I keep coming across there are inspiring people here. I'm in a privileged position. I don't live here. I just pop in and out, you know, say some annoying things, talk to people, and go off back to Gotham City, where I live half the time, New York, which the real Gotham City, or to Leeds, which is a much more relaxing and civilized place to live than either Bangkok or Gotham City, I must say. So I'm in a privileged position, but people who are living here and struggling against these daily realities and trying to open up the political space that has been closing, I think we have to really hand it to them. And yeah, the analogy that you make with Gotham City is clearly very pertinent. Yeah, the big capitalist groups. I wish people were working on this more. There was a time in the 80s and 90s when we had good political economists who were really doing fieldwork-based research, but just not enough people writing about this stuff. And I don't have the expertise. I don't understand how these big companies work. I haven't studied enough about that. And perhaps you're going to help us with this, but we need a new generation of people to do the kind of work that Kevin Hewison was doing in the 80s, really look at the interconnections between the big business groups. I haven't read anything really good about this lately. There used to be good work on it, and we need more good work on it. What we do see is most of these groups are putting their eggs in every basket. They might even come along and support these progressive parties if they think they have a chance of winning a few seats, because their policy has normally been to support everybody. And then whoever comes out on top, they'll still be in a good situation. But that whole way of operating needs critical scrutiny. The media is not scrutinizing it critically, and this is because of structural problems in the way the media works that I wrote about before, again in the 1990s, and I haven't gone back to update, but we can see the same kind of problem. A lot of what's written about the business world in Thailand is just a press release that comes directly from the company saying how great their latest project is, and we have very few business journalists who write serious business stories about what is actually going on, and what's going on between the beverage companies, the development, land development, construction companies, the hotel companies, the consumer foods groups companies. All this stuff needs scrutiny from both media and academics, civil society and consumer groups who are not getting a good deal out of a lot of the arrangements that are taking place. And we just don't have enough of this. It's part of a larger problem that there isn't enough critical scrutiny of things in general in Thailand, but you're absolutely right to point the finger at this is an area where people should be writing, there should be websites where people are posting critical reports about these kind of companies. That happens more in the Philippines or other Southeast Asian countries, but in Thailand there doesn't seem to be a tradition of really watching what these corporate giants are up to and, you know, calling them to account. And I do believe that they could be called to account, and that if people were really posting critical stuff about them, they might even adapt, maybe not their fundamental strategies, but some of their modes of behavior. But they're just getting away with whatever they want now because the media is doing nothing, and we have virtually no academics who are specializing in this intersection between business and politics. We really need it.
Okay, thank you. We still have time, 10 minutes left. Any comments? Questions or any thoughts? One, two more. Okay, and I also have questions from one people who watch our Facebook live.
Oh wow! Okay.
So this day your job is tougher.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Speaker this day.
I know.
To answer, you know, the questions in the room and on the social media.
Right. Okay.
Start from Ajahn.
So, I have to say that I'm not a politician. I'm not a politics scientist. I'm a scientist.
Right.
So I would like to ask one big question: that what is actually politics for the country? What is politics for?
Okay.
Okay. Next, Mark.
Hello, my name is Mark. Really appreciate the question. Just a simple question about on the relationship with corruption. Politician corruption. After the assault went on, just across the region.
Last question.
สวัสดีครับ My name is Jirawat Rinatadi, PhD candidate. My dissertation about the oratory data which have a question about the challenge of the political science study But now, your slide showed that political space shift to the social media. As we know about the post-truth. But now, in Bangkok, we have the Facebook user 22 million. Bangkok now, we are the metropolitan of the Facebook.
Yes.
Very challenge for the professor in the political science. How you explain or teach your students about what is the political, what is the like a political party or the election, because a lot of the people they study or they learn about the Thai politics from the Facebook or the social media. I think this is a challenge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Again, not getting easier for you.
Not really, no. Okay, what's politics for? Wow. Okay. Yeah. It's obviously situational. I mean, look, for me, politics is a study of power. In studying politics, we're trying to understand. Tony Benn, famous British Labour Party MP, who sadly passed away, said that, you know, what politics is about is finding out, you know, how people get hold of power, how they exercise power, and how you can remove them from power. And these are really the political questions. But then, of course, you're going to say, well, what's power? And power is almost everything. And so politics, for me, is a very, very broad subject. And what is politics itself is difficult to define because so many things relate to these questions about exercising power. But what politics is for, well, politics in the real world is, politics is all about how power is exercised, and what's politics supposed to be for. It's supposed to be exercised for the benefit of people, but those of us who study politics are, of course, always trying to find out how far power is being exercised for the public benefit, or how far it's being exercised for the benefit of the people who themselves have the power in their hands. So these are the questions. Now, I could talk for a lot longer, but I'm conscious that this is a very big question, and I probably would need to give you, you know, a 1-hour answer to satisfy. And I'm also in a room full of political scientists, so this is a bit of a challenge for me to distill everything to its essence. But those are the kinds of things that immediately come to mind in response to your question. Corruption and democracy, yeah, well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you know, corruption became a label that non-politicians attached to politicians in a country like Thailand. So corruption got a very bad name, and it's a way of also giving politicians a bad name. But corruption's also associated with a lot of bureaucratic institutions. Militaries can be corrupt. Other agencies can be corrupt as well. So we have to look at the whole thing in the round. I mean, clearly corruption became a huge issue in the Malaysian election, although my Malaysian friends told me it wasn't as big an issue inside the country as it was outside the country. Corruption was a big issue in Indonesia with the fall of Suharto, where there was a big campaign against korupsi, kolusi, nepotism. Corruption, collusion, and nepotism. These are part of the driving agendas behind the Reformasi movement in Indonesia. So, and of course, in Thailand, corruption has regularly been invoked as something to criticize people for, and it was one of the main accusations leveled against previous governments, including the Thaksin and Yingluck government. So, corruption is one of those things that you can't get away from. It's always popping back up. But the question for me is always about who is talking about corruption, with what purpose, who is going to benefit from this discussion about corruption, and are the people themselves who are raising the issue of corruption completely to be trusted on this issue? If we go and look at where they live, do their houses seem to be commensurate with their salaries? Do their assets declarations make any sense? So, again, it's a big question. Definitely, it's been important in an election like the Malaysian election, but I also feel like this kind of politics, because the kind of politics we're moving into is less about issues, you don't necessarily need an issue like corruption that you're campaigning against corruption, or even you may not even need to use as much money in this kind of mediated populist era, because it becomes about other things that are sort of beyond policy issues. not sure if I've really answered your question, but it was a big one. I wrote my PhD about a guy called Jamlong Srimurung who became governor of Bangkok by campaigning against corruption. And that was a kind of a mode of politics that has existed at certain times, but usually it's not enough in itself, I think, to get people elected. Yeah. Yes, people get all their political information from Facebook. Yeah, we try to get students to read books and articles, and we're finding it harder and harder. I don't know about you, but I'm finding it harder and harder in Leeds and even Columbia. Students tend to be able to find out a lot of information. If I ask them a question, like if I asked students, you know, how big is corruption as a political issue in Southeast Asia? Quite a lot of them are immediately on their phones, and I can see they've gone to the Wikipedia page about corruption, or they're Googling corruption, democracy, Southeast Asia. So the solution for a lot of people now is just to go to some website which is going to answer their questions. And obviously those of us who are trying to do research about politics and teach politics are attempting to get students to stop looking for the answers on Wikipedia and construct an academic argument based on some sources and some readings and things like that. And that is a constant struggle. So on the one hand, the rise of social media, of Facebook and so on, it's been a boon in terms of getting people more aware of what's going on, and it's increased participation, and we wanted to increase participation. But then we start getting sniffy about that and saying, but yes, but it's increased participation in the wrong way. What we want is a deeper participation, a more nuanced participation, a better informed participation. And that's the trade-off. So yeah, we got people more interested in politics, but at what price? At the price of, you know, being too tempted to reduce it to superficialities, and that's a downside.
Thank you. Okay, so I think now we can have one last round of questions. Any questions, comments? Okay.
Okay.
What do you want? Okay, so you have a hat trick now.
Yeah, you're the most enthusiastic questioner.
Thank you. My last question is just regarding this of the white hole. I'm really sorry, I don't understand.
Yeah, the photo. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and before you answer that question, I have one question, and she insists that I have to ask this question. So, the question is, what do you find are the roles of election in Southeast Asia to authoritarian leaders? Is still necessary for them to appear democratic in the global stage, considering there's not much pressure from USA under Trump's administration, or the leaders are trying to appear democratic for domestic audience. So I guess the question is why authoritarian leaders in the region bother to whole election. I think your point that you try to make in the presentation.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, the white horse thing, well, clearly, if you ride into a stadium on a horse as part of your election campaign, that gives a certain kind of signal about what sort of person you are and what kind of power you would like to exercise. It doesn't seem particularly democratic or participatory. It rather suggests that you have delusions of grandeur and that you're emulating some of the features of the dictatorship that is supposed to have been washed away after the 1998 Reformasi movement in Indonesia. But, you know, Prabowo is himself Suharto's former son-in-law. He was married to one of Suharto's daughters. And so there's a sense in which by riding into the stadium, he's epitomizing... I mean, Suharto, to my knowledge, never rode into a stadium on a horse. I mean, he's going further than is strictly necessary in aggrandizing himself. And to me, a white horse is more striking. There aren't that many white horses. Most horses are brown. So if you're on a white horse, you know, it's like a white elephant is a rare elephant. A white horse is a little bit rarer. So it's really giving it some kind of added meaning. But I found it very ironic that although I couldn't find a picture of him on a white horse, he did get Jokowi to sit on a white horse, trying to get Jokowi to look, you know, I mean, he's the one who rides, and Jokowi doesn't look very comfortable on the horse because he obviously doesn't have his own ranch in Bogor and he doesn't go horse riding every afternoon like Prabowo does. So he's kind of got him onto his territory and he's bringing him to his level. And it's a way of kind of ridiculing Jokowi because you've got this provincial guy who obviously doesn't ride horses sitting very uncomfortably on a white horse of all horses next to Prabowo, who's the master horseman. So those are there are just a lot of levels of iconic irony in that photograph for me, but maybe I'm obsessed with the levels of iconic irony in photographs. And yeah, the why still have elections question is, I mean, the person is asking a question which I already asked, and I was throwing it out there. I didn't exactly answer it myself. I think Ajahn Gassian was sort of alluding to the answer to the question as well. Why do you still have elections? Well, clearly there's a need. You know, this is what electoralism to me is a kind of ideology which is separate from actually wanting people to select their representatives, but a belief in elections almost for their own sake. So elections take on a kind of life of their own, even if the meaning of elections has been hollowed out. But basically what I'm saying is that it's a source of legitimacy to have elections. Even communist countries where there's only one ruling party and all the candidates would be from the same party continue to have elections. So we shouldn't, what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't confuse the holding of elections with any actual commitment to democracy. They might go together, but they could actually be completely separate exercises, as I'm suggesting they were in the Cambodian case, and I'm hoping they will not be in the Thai case.
Yeah. Okay. One last question, and I will end with this question because
okay.
know you exhausted already.
I'm fine.
You fine?
Yeah.
We go for more questions. Don't say that.
Yeah.
People will ask more questions.
Okay.
But I think I know the person who asked the question. You are in the room, right?
Okay. Okay. Some people, rather than putting their hand up, would like. But it's just people are communicating through social media. It illustrates my point exactly. Yeah.
Yes, and you put your real name in the social media, right? It's not anonymous. So, okay. Now I put you on the spot. Do you want me to ask a question or? Okay.
Yes, clearly.
She's cheating because I think she's asking you to give her answer about her dissertation.
Okay.
Okay.
That's always difficult. That's always difficult. Yeah.
Okay. About the populism and redistribution. How does populism in economics term affect middle class and elite? And how do the role of middle class and the role of elite affect probability of democratization? That's your dissertation questions, right? So you should ask Professor Duncan to be external examiner.
Yeah, right.
Okay, feel free to,
to
answer.
Sorry, I'm not sure I took all of it in, but how far did? No, what was the question? What was the key point again? It was about the middle class and the elite, and yeah. Sorry, I'm getting a little.
The populist policies pursued by government like Thaksin.
Okay.
Affect, I think, the middle class and the elite.
Okay.
The way that this government try to redistribute wealth to the lower class or the poor, the rural area.
Right. Yeah, it's a long story. I probably have to sit down with you and get a clearer idea of what your dissertation is exactly about. I mean, as I said, I think there's a problem with this idea about populism and populist policies, where it just became synonymous with the Thaksin government, and somehow, I don't see these policies as being that populist. I'm not going to the extreme of some of my colleagues of saying Thaksin wasn't a populist at all. But I think what's happened is that this idea about populism has taken on a life of its own, so it's very difficult to distinguish. Any policy that people might want to vote for because it benefits them can then be labeled as a populist policy, according to this kind of scenario. But yeah, clearly what we're talking about here is, what you seem to be getting at is middle classes and elites might become alarmed that political parties are using popular policies, or populist policies if you prefer, in order to mobilize voters in such a way that they might support a political party which runs counter to their interests, and it's some of the stuff that I've been talking about before. But I don't know where I can really go in terms of really decisively answering the question without having more sense of exactly what it is that you're really wanting to ask. So it's part and parcel of exactly this problem, that once larger numbers of people become aware of their capacity to influence public policy decisions, if you like, by voting for a particular party, then it's very threatening to those people who feel that they're not benefiting from this, and they become alarmed, and then the populist label goes on, and the polarization increases. But yeah, I think I would need to spend a bit more time getting my head around exactly what you're trying to find out in order to advise you further on that one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Duncan. I think now it's time to close our session.
Oh, really?
We will invite you more, and you have to come back.
Yeah, right.
And okay, I want to end with a hopeful note, like Duncan hope next year is a good year, hopeful year for our region, Southeast Asia. And please join me to give a big round of applause to Professor Duncan McCargo. He worked so hard today.
Thanks very much.
And thank you everyone for coming. And please go to check our website and Facebook page.
Yes.
That's another job of mine to promote it as a director and deputy dean for research affairs and academic service of Faculty of Political Science. Please go check website Direct Chayanam Research Center. We will announce all the events of academic seminar in that Facebook page. Thank you everyone again.